It is your love and affection. Wow, wow. Girl, you're sweet and I just had to mention. Yeah, yeah. Hold me, darling. All night we jamming. Yeah. Dum 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 dum. Hello, 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 hello. Hello, 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 hello. Yeah. She had the thing I love. Where she from, I don't know. Rock she waist and go low. She kick up the place like a toto, yeah. Say what you say, what you say, what you say. It's the girl who you come my way. What you do, what you do, what you do. I must get to.
So this is where I gotta say good morning to everyone that is locked in a Power 95 right now. Beautiful Thursday morning. Welcome inside another edition of your ladies room. Of course, yours truly Kareem. I'm your host for this morning. So you know, we live on Facebook as well, guys. Alright, so you can come in, hit the share button. You don't want to miss this one this morning, alright? Got a very special guest in studio today with me, and we're going to be talking the Grenada Revolution. Alright, that's what we're talking today. So come on in, hit the share button, and let's get ready to go, alright?
I'll give you that sweet type of love. Sweet type of love. I'll give you that sweet type of love. Real type of love. Hold me, darling. All night we jamming. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Dum 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 dum.
Alright, and again, we got to say welcome to everybody. Welcome inside of your ladies room Thursday. It's a beautiful one. Hope you guys are good. Hope your day is going good so far. And we got to say thank you so much for joining us. Another edition of your ladies room today, powered by Western Union and Beacon Insurance. Alright, with me in studio today, very, very, very special guest. Very special indeed. Alright, I call her mom. She has been a mom to me for the last lot of years. Alright, she has been a mentor to me, role model, and it is indeed a pleasure to have her visit us inside Power 95 this morning. Dr. Nicole Phillip-Dowe, how are you today?
Fine, thank you, Kareem. It's wonderful to be sitting with my student, former student, always son, older son. So it's a pleasure to be here this morning.
All right, thank you so much for joining us. Now, this morning we are talking the Grenada Revolution, 1979, March 13th to be specific. All right, we know we're a couple days early, but we saw it fit to have this discussion today to just get an insight into what actually transpired, what went down, and to see how do we commemorate the Grenada Revolution. All right, but before we dive into it, let's get a little bit of background leading up to 1979.
Okay, I'd like to start off by saying that Grenada has a very colorful history, and the 1979 revolution is the third revolution in Grenada's history. We started off with 1795, the Fedon Rebellion, then 1951, Gary's Social Revolution, and by 1979, we have a Socialist Revolution. The Socialist Revolution basically propels Grenada onto the Caribbean and to the international stage because the revolution is a socialist revolution, and it's a change in ideology that is taking place at this point. The world is divided between a capitalist ideology and a socialist/communist ideology. So for a tiny island like Grenada to have gone to that side of the fence, it was quite a big thing. And Grenada would have been the first in the English-speaking Caribbean to have gone to socialism as an option for development. So in that is the context in which we want to look at the Grenada Revolution. The causes of the revolution would have been, at the time, the group who would have taken over, they're feeling that the Gary regime was not necessarily meeting all the needs of the Grenadian people. And we must plug in here that when Gary came into power in 51, he would have come in as a people's messiah, basically challenging the colonial powers at the time, demanding better working conditions, better wages. And he would have done some phenomenal things that basically would have been even outside of his time. When you think of Expo 69, the exposure of Grenada as a tourist destination, and you think of the establishment of St. George's University, it was very forward thinking.
Right.
But unfortunately, sometimes politicians get a little lost along the way. And so you had misappropriation of government funds, you had victimization and violence to persons who opposed Gary. And coming out of that, the 1979 revolution takes place. It is a military coup, again, the first in the English-speaking Caribbean. So that is the context, basically, of the Grenada Revolution of 1979.
But what would you say, though, are some of the successes coming off the revolution, though? Because
the revolution had successes as well as there were flaws and failures. So we can look at some of the very obvious ones. The building of the international airport, for example.
Right.
Grenada would have had Pearls Airport, and if you were a visitor and you were coming from other parts of the world to Grenada, you had to pass through Barbados, or you had to pass through Trinidad to get to Grenada, because Pearls could not accommodate, large flights. So it was absolutely necessary for the expansion of the tourist industry to have an international airport. So the building of the international airport, with the assistance of the government and people of Cuba, was extremely important. There was funding from other countries like Syria, Iraq, Libya, under Colonel Gaddafi. So that was one benefit. The other is the National Insurance Scheme. That sort of insurance scheme that makes sure that everyone, once they get to a particular age in terms of pensions and that sort of stuff, was done under the
so that was actually formed under
that revolutionary period. We had the agro-industries. So for example, farmers, now we see mangoes on the ground, sapodillos on the ground spoiling. Those things would have been brought to the agro-industries plant and frequently at the time and turned into jams and jellies and mango nectar and tamarind nectar. And you might know how old I am, but the mango nectar and the tamarind nectar tasted really good. Grenada would have won prizes, on the international market for those things. So agro-industries was extremely important. The establishment of a fishery school, we were actually able to produce our own salted fish during that period as well. One of the other highlights is education. The PRG took education to a new level. For example, saying that there's now free secondary education. Prior to that, if you wanted to go to a secondary school, your parents needed to have the money to send you. So a lot of persons did not make it that far because they didn't have the funding to get there. And it was not only about free secondary education, but school books and uniforms were part of the program as well. And then you had extension of tertiary education in terms of scholarships, mainly to socialist countries, because as I said, the revolution was socialist, and also an adult literacy. It was called the CPE, or the Center for Popular Education, where persons who never knew how to read and write before got that opportunity to actually learn to read and to learn to write. So these were some of the major successes of the Grenada Revolution. For women, because I must talk about women, two of the major successes was the maternity leave law, which we still have up to today. Prior to that, if you got pregnant, the possibility existed that you could lose your job. So what that did was to insist that they can go back to work, they can get 3 months maternity leave, and that leave would be paid for. The other thing was equality of wages. Prior to 1979, women who worked, for example, in the agricultural industry, they were paid 1/3 less than men. In 1979, and actually 1980, there is now the equality of wages. So women were getting paid the same that their male counterparts were getting paid.
Okay.
Yes. So these are some of the benefits of the revolution.
Because every time revolution, the topic of revolution comes up, you hear a wide cross section of the population who were around in that time saying that Maurice was such a good prime minister. He was actually their favorite prime minister. However, when you look at it from a youth perspective, you were in there, you're reading the history and so on, you wonder, how could it be that way when he had to be assassinated essentially in the end, right? So he's actually looking at these positives perhaps that he actually did for the country during the time.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yes, definitely.
In terms of flaws though,
Yes.
because everything has the upside and the
and
downside.
the downside, yes. And for the Grenada Revolution, there were quite a few flaws. One of them would have been no elections. When the revolution started in 79, one of the things that was said was that there will be free and fair elections.
He said that in
And-
a speech.
Exactly. And that did not happen. The revolution's theory at the time was that if they had elections, they were opening the doors to counter-revolutionary elements who could sabotage the whole process. The downside to that is that if there was election, it would legitimize the revolution, because even though they came to power through a military coup, once you have an election, it would say, and you got the popular vote, you are now legitimate as a legitimate government.
Right.
And that would have probably allayed some of the issues, foreign policy issues that Grenada had with other islands in the region who were not comfortable. Some were, some were not. And of course, with the United States as well. So that was an issue. The other issue was trial without, imprisonment without trial. Imprisonment without trial, the freedom of the press being restricted. So, for example, closing down of the Torchlight newspaper, because the newspaper would have been printing what was seen as anti-government, counter-revolutionary thoughts, feelings, so shutting that down, restricting freedom of speech, and imprisonment without trial. So if you did not agree with the way the revolution was going, the policies of the revolution, you could find yourself basically in prison. And quite a number of persons were imprisoned during that period. Some historians have put the estimate as high as 3,000. Others have put it a little lower, to be about 800 persons during that time. Whether 800, whether 3,000, within a Grenadian context of 100,000 people, that is quite a lot of persons. The other problem was that during the period of Gary, the members of the People's Revolutionary Government would have felt the brunt of Gary's violence towards them and victimization towards them through the use of Gary's infamous Mongoose Gang. So they were beaten. They found themselves in situations where their houses were searched. So they would have felt that. But unfortunately, when they came to power, they did exactly the same thing. And some persons would argue even worse.
Right.
So that, again, worked against them. Another issue that was flagged was what can be defined as the militarization of the people. And that is the influx of ammunition into Grenada to protect the revolution. And the concern was the amount of young persons that would have had that sort of military training, would have had access to guns, and that was a concern during the time as well. I remember interviewing one woman, and she didn't want to give her name. But she was noting she's looking at the Grenville car park, and there are 15 and 16-year-olds being able to scrap a AK-47 and put it back together again.
Are you kidding me?
So those were some of the really strong issues with the revolution. And the last part that leads to the implosion of the Grenada Revolution really is the issue of joint leadership. And it became a sore thumb to the point where things got totally out of hand and you ended up with an assassination. Joint leadership basically was not new to the New Jewel movement, which became eventually morphed into People's Revolutionary Government. It's just that by the time they got to People's Revolutionary Government, you had Morris as Prime Minister. And the idea was that he was really responsible he was a very charismatic leader. So meeting the people, speaking with the people, going off to international fora and discussing the revolution on Grenada's behalf. And Bernard Court as Deputy Prime Minister dealing with things like tactics and strategy and that sort of stuff. It worked well when it was not necessarily written. But once it got to the point where it is said that it needs to be written, this is how it has to be, there must be two leaders as opposed to one leader. There was a situation where Bishop would have felt a vote of no confidence against him, and he would have reacted to this. And the issue came about when he said yes to the idea, and then he changed his mind. And in changing his mind, a series of events takes place. He's arrested, placed under house arrest for quote unquote starting a rumor. And the people take him out of house arrest. And another flaw is, instead of going to the market square to chat with the people and say, well, what's happening, he goes to the fort. So there's now a retake of a military establishment. And the part that still makes absolutely no sense, even when the fort is retaken, that Morris and others were taken to the parade square and executed. Unfortunately, it's not the first time in Grenada's history we've had an issue of head of state, prime minister being executed. And again, for that inability to compromise, and that inability to find common ground. And so 1795, fed on wanting to take over Grenada, haven't taken over Grenada to the point where the only place he didn't take over was the actual town of St. George's. He basically would have had the governor and a number of members of the Legislative Council and very prominent planters, and they were lined up and shot as well. Same sort of execution style.
Wow.
And it speaks to that adherence to a particular ideology that can cause persons to, I use the term very loosely, lose their heads and basically resort to violence. The inability to compromise, inability to deal with conflict and to resolve conflict peacefully and amicably can lead to situations like that. And in our case, it has happened twice in our history. So we pray God Almighty that it never, ever happens again.
That would not be nice.
No, we have to avoid that. Definitely.
But you know, listening to it is so crazy because I mean, I've read this speech at around I think it was around 4 a.m. in the morning that Maurice gave that speech. You know, when they went on the radio, and I mean, if you listen to it, you know, you would get that sort of perception that he wanted freedom for the people from the dictatorship. You know,
Right.
so he spoke about the elections, healthcare, better wages, providing work for the people and stuff like that. So it's kind of crazy that a couple years after, he is being assassinated for essentially doing the same thing.
Yep. And that's the one of the difficulties in understanding the Grenada Revolution. It's extremely complex. You look at the upside of it, the successes of the revolution. You look at the revolution making changes, using a different mode of making these changes. Great social changes, great changes within the economy, but using it within a socialist context. So the rest of the region is looking on to see, well, how does this actually work in Grenada? But then at the same time, having internal issues that eventually leads to an assassination, which really and truly could have been avoided if as I mentioned earlier, that strict adherence to doctrine did not take place, and that willingness to compromise. One of the things that comes out of the Grenada's historical experience is that one historian calls it the hero and the crowd. A sort of the prime minister or the person in charge is seen as a hero, seen as, in Gary's case, as a messiah almost. And it's almost like a hero worship from the crowd or the masses or the people to that one particular person.
Right.
And unfortunately, that somehow leads to the person, whoever that person may be, getting that feeling that they're almost invincible. And that is also a problem. And that is one of the things that in moving forward, we have to be sure that the person in charge does not get to that point where that person feels that it's almost like some persons call it like a benevolent dictator. I know exactly what I'm doing for the sake of the people. And we've had that happen in Grenada's history at least twice. Yeah. But it's not just Grenada, it's a Caribbean thing. If you speak to persons from other parts of the region and you say one particular party, back in the 60s and 70s, if you said PNM, they would tell you Eric Williams, you know. If you said GULP, they would say Gary. You think of even today, if you say NNP, we would say Keith Mitchell. And it's just the way that Caribbean people react to their leaders.
Right.
Unfortunately, it causes problems and difficulties when there is a change, when there's a difference of opinion. And if those differences are not sorted out peacefully, we could end up with...
That's when we get to that point.
That's unfortunately...
1983.
We can get to a 1983. And I'm putting this as simply as possible because, as I said, it's a very complex part of our history. But I'm trying to bring it as simply as possible in what would have been the causes of the actual implosion, of the revolution.
What would you say, though, is the importance of the Grenada Revolution in a Caribbean context?
When Grenada would have gone on that route to socialist revolution, as I mentioned, it's the first in the English-speaking Caribbean to have done this. So it's new. There were other socialist parties within the region, Jamaica, Guyana, for example. However, Grenada comes out with this revolutionary idea and revolutionary concept, and the changes that Grenada is able to make, especially social changes, are absolutely phenomenal in terms of the small size of the country, and to the point where you had persons, intellectuals coming from other parts of the region to work in Grenada. So Professor Merle Hodge out of Trinidad, Professor Brian Meeks out of Jamaica, Dr. Didicus Jules out of St. Lucia, Dr. Richard Hart out of Jamaica, coming to work in different aspects of the Grenada Revolution because it was seen as a means of change. It's like a breath of fresh air, basically, in moving towards change in the region, but in doing it from a totally different perspective. So within the Caribbean context, Grenada was looked at as an example,
right.
For some. For others, they were not very amused. So Barbados under Tom Adams, Dominica under Eugenia Charles, Jamaica under Edward Seaga were not necessarily happy with Grenada's movement towards socialism. And then the broader context, of course, we found ourselves in a situation where we have gone on the opposite side of the fence to the United States. And Kareem, of course, you're going to remember this from history. U.S. foreign policy that speaks to manifest destiny and Monroe Doctrine, and that this part of the world, this part of the Western Hemisphere, is basically their neck of the woods, and they expect things to be done the way they would like it, following similar rules, similar forms, similar norms as the U.S. So when Grenada goes outside of the box, it raises a lot of red flags, right? Because the only other country to have done that would have been within the Caribbean context would have been Cuba. And this is this little 2x4 island who decides that they want to try this and they want to do this. And then, of course, we weren't necessarily very quiet about it. We were very bold.
No, because he even said, if any international powers try to tamper in the affairs of Grenada, he's going to see it as an international offense.
Exactly. So when Morris makes this speech that we are in nobody's backyard and we're definitely not for sale, I mean, a little island trying to,
Little 2x4.
Little 2x4 basically standing up to the United States and saying, no, you can't tell me who I should and should not have diplomatic relations with. And that speech came out of Grenada having diplomatic relations with Cuba and friendly relations with Cuba. And that was the response. So we were basically thrown onto the regional stage, and onto the international stage, because we're now friends with Cuba, we have relations with Libya, we have relations with the USSR at the time, with socialist countries. So it's an exciting experience for some nations within the region looking at Grenada. And some would even argue that some of the social policies of the Grenada Revolution and the fact that these policies were actually working well, some historians are arguing that Grenada is, of course, a predominantly black culture and black population, and the question is, how is this new brand of looking at things, new brand of doing things, a socialist orientation, how is that going to be looked at by blacks within the United States or the black diaspora within the United States? Would they want something similar? Yeah.
Right.
So these are some of it's not just about Grenada, but it's about a Caribbean context and a world context as well. And when his name just went straight out of my head, President Reagan comes to the fore, he's very clear that he's rolling back communism. Yeah. He's not going to accept
in no uncertain terms.
He's not going to accept this sort of thing happening within the region. Now the revolution implodes before, but the US were very clear about that. They would have had maneuvers in the region that kind of simulated, the possibility if they had to. And of course, we know the effects of the implosion would have been October 25th, 1983, with a US-led. And there's controversy on this intervention.
Oh yeah.
Depends on how you look at it.
That topic will go on forever.
Yes, it would.
Somebody needs to write a book, and I think I'm going to do it.
There've been a lot of writings on it. Was it legal for the President of the United States to do something like this? What was the role of the Governor General at the time? Did he actually give them the permission to do so? What right did Jamaica, Barbados, and so on have to come into Grenada at the time? There's a lot of back and forth.
Because if you look at it, with Bishop saying that, hey, you guys mind your business,
yes,
so to speak, just mind your business, and all of a sudden you have no ties in Grenada,
yeah.
all of a sudden you have pay out of nowhere. I think that's kind of how people look at it. But lessons to be learned from the Grenada Revolution.
The lessons to be learned, I think I alluded to at least two of them before. One of them is conflict resolution and the ability to compromise. It is absolutely necessary, and you may think of it, it's a simple thing. It's not so simple, because when persons have a very strong belief, and if there can be no middle ground, you have positions of problems.
Right.
So on October 19th, for example, there comes a point on October 19th when the words that was said was no negotiation, no compromise. Now, at that point, it's like somebody was going to die. You just was not sure who. And it should not get to that point. Yep. Somebody needed to say, stop it. All right. If joint leadership is not working, if Maurice Bishop wasn't happy about it, he wasn't comfortable about it, we needed to get back to the drawing board, get back to the table, get back to having, some sort of discussion. And sometimes our pride gets into it. In the case of the Grenada Revolution, you also had an ideology that said this is the way we're supposed to go. So we were not thinking of the practicality of it in terms of a Grenadian context. Yep. Not just a Grenada, but a Caribbean context in which you have that hero and crowd situation.
Right.
Those things were not thought about, because you're following a Marxist-Leninist vanguard, which is what was followed at the time. So that strict adherence to ideology can cause problems. So that's some of the lessons that we need to learn. We also have to understand there must be checks and balances in the executive. Prime Minister, President, as the case may be, not only in Grenada, but in the region. That's one of the things that we have. There must be some form of checks and balances. And the other thing is that division, where we tend to see, coming out of the revolution, it would have been codite, bishopite. You're either on one side of the fence or you're on the
you're
next.
on the other. Mhm.
And that would have caused division in families. Friendships would have broken because of this. And unfortunately, we've gone into a situation where our politics is either one color or the other. And that doesn't necessarily work for Grenada. And that's one of the lessons that we have to learn. It is about country and not necessarily about who you support or which side of the fence that you support. So that country always has to come first.
Right.
Yes.
Finally, before we go, Doc, the importance of studying the Grenada Revolution. What are some of the importance of studying that?
We don't really commemorate the Grenada Revolution. There are few people who still will, and it's understandable. I'm going to say something very controversial. It's understandable because of the way the revolution ended, right? For a lot of people, there has been no closure. You didn't get a body that you can actually bury. So you understand why people would have reservations about it. Why, if you ask persons questions, they may just say, I don't want to talk about it at all.
Oh, yeah.
And then you have persons who, if you talk about the revolution, they get very excited because of the successes of the revolution. So we don't commemorate it on a national level. University of the West Indies, both Open Campus and Cave Hill, we joined with St. George's University on the 40th anniversary in 2019. And we had a 3-day conference on the revolution, looking basically at all aspects of it, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And for us, the main thing was getting students to come in and to hear the different speakers talk about the revolution.
Right.
And what came out of that was the students' response. For a lot of them, they did not have a clue about what happened, how it happened, why it happened, or the nitty-gritty, and bits and pieces that they did not know. And I think that is a way that we are failing our youth. Grenada's story, because our history is basically our story. And the fact that we don't teach our story to our children is unfortunate. When you look at other islands in the region, their history, their story is something that's taught to students. Primary
proud of
school,
it.
exactly. Primary school, secondary school. And we have one of the most colorful histories in the region. And yet we have not taken that bold step to say that we want to teach our children. And it's to their disadvantage that they don't know what happened within their own country. And it's not just 1790, 83, that's a short period. But what about Gary and the things that Gary would have done? What about even like the Fedon Rebellion? What about persons like T.A. Marichaud? What contributions did he make to Grenada? These are some of the things that we need to talk about, that students need to be aware of. They need to know their story, because our story is who we are as a people. Yep. We love carnival, we love jab jab, we love all of those wonderful things, but we need to understand how it came about. Why do we celebrate carnival in the way that we do? Why do we have jab jab in Grenada? Why do we have shotney? Why do we have veko? You understand? So it's a whole learning experience that our youth need to know, and it is our responsibility to teach them about Grenada's story, because it is their story.
Definitely. I have so many people saying here that they've never heard it broken down on this level. So, Doc, we got to say thank you so much.
You're
thank
very
you
welcome.
so very much. All right. And we definitely hope that we can have you back again sometime so we can learn a little more.
Yes.
Right, because there is a lot to learn from Grenada's past. All right, but guys, we gotta go. We gotta say thank you so much to everyone that powered up inside of your ladies' room today, and of course, we gotta say thank you to Western Union and Beacon Insurance for making it happen. All right, so this is the final one for this week, so you can join us again on Monday for another one. All right. In the meantime, keep it locked on right here on Power 95.